What if I told you that the language you're speaking right now, the government building in your city, and even the calendar on your phone all trace back to a single place? Imagine a world where bandits and shepherds living on muddy Italian hills would eventually command legions that stretched from the freezing forests of Britain to the scorching deserts of Egypt, where farmers would become senators and senators would become gods. This is the story of Rome. Not just an empire, but a civilization that refused to die. For over 2,000 years, through 22 centuries of triumph and disaster, Rome shaped everything we know about power, law, war, and what it means to be human. You think Game of Thrones is brutal? You think Marvel superheroes are epic? Wait until you hear about real people who conquered the known world, only to watch it crumble in their hands. Wait until you meet emperors who built wonders that still make us gasp, and others who were so insane they declared war on the sea itself. This isn't just ancient history gathering dust in textbooks. This is the blueprint for every democracy, every constitution, every road, every empire that came after. Rome didn't just rule the world, it invented the world we live in today. So forget everything you think you know about the past. We're about to dive into the most incredible true story ever told, the rise and fall of Rome. Let's start with a story so crazy that if it were in a movie, you'd call it unrealistic. Two newborn babies thrown into a river to die, saved by a wolf who nurses them as her own cubs. These boys grow up to become warriors, then decide to build a city. But here's where it gets dark. They can't agree on who should rule, so one brother murders the other and names the city after himself. That's the legend of Romulus and Remus, and it's the founding myth of Rome. The Romans believed this story so deeply that they dated everything from the year Rome was founded, 753 BCE. But here's the thing about legends. They often hide deeper truths. The real story is even more fascinating than the myth. Archaeological evidence reveals that Rome didn't spring from the ambitions of two brothers. It grew organically from a collection of small villages scattered across 7 hills along the Tiber River. These early settlers weren't the mighty Romans we imagine. They were just one of many Italian tribes scraping out a living in a harsh world. What made them special wasn't their origin story. It was their neighbors. To the north lived a civilization so advanced and mysterious that historians are still trying to understand them. The Etruscans. The Etruscans were the Silicon Valley of the ancient world. They had technology the Romans couldn't even dream of. Sophisticated metallurgy, advanced agriculture, and engineering that seemed like magic. Their cities had paved streets and sewage systems when Rome was still a collection of mud huts. But most importantly, the Etruscans understood something that would become Rome's greatest strength: how to organize people. They taught the Romans about government, about law, about turning a loose collection of tribes into something bigger. Without the Etruscans, Rome would have remained just another forgotten Italian village. Instead, it became the foundation of everything that followed. The Romans may have gotten the credit, but they were standing on Etruscan shoulders. So how did these mud-dwelling villagers become the Romans we know? It all started with power, and the people who knew how to use it. For the first 244 years, Rome was ruled by 7 kings. Each one contributed something important to what would become Roman culture. The first king, Romulus, supposedly created the Roman Senate and divided people into different classes. The second king, Numa, gave Romans their religious traditions. The third, Tullus Hostilius, was all about war and conquest. But here's what's really important about this period. The Romans were developing their unique character. They believed in duty, honor, and serving the state. Unlike other ancient peoples who served kings or gods first, Romans believed their highest calling was to serve Rome itself. This might sound boring, but it was revolutionary. It meant that Romans would sacrifice everything for their city. This mindset would carry them through centuries of wars and make them nearly unstoppable. But here's the thing about absolute power. It corrupts absolutely. And by 509 BCE, the Romans had had enough. By 509 BCE, the Romans had had enough of kings. The last king, Tarquin the Proud, was a tyrant who abused his power. So the Romans did something almost unthinkable for the ancient world. They got rid of him and decided to rule themselves. They created something called a republic. Instead of one king, they had two leaders called consuls who served for only 1 year. They had a senate full of experienced advisors. They had assemblies where regular citizens could vote. But here's the genius part. They built in checks and balances. No one person could have too much power. The consuls could veto each other. The Senate could advise but not command. The people could vote, but within limits. This system wasn't perfect. It was messy and sometimes chaotic. But it worked for nearly 500 years. And it gave birth to an idea that still shapes our world today. That people can govern themselves. But Rome's new republic had a serious problem. It wasn't fair for everyone. And when people are risking their lives for a system that doesn't give them a voice, revolution is inevitable. Early Rome wasn't fair for everyone. Society was divided into two main groups, the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the aristocrats, the wealthy families who claimed to be descended from the original senators. The plebeians were everyone else, farmers, craftsmen, traders, and laborers. At first, only patricians could hold important offices or know the laws. This created a huge problem. The plebeians made up most of the population and most of the army, but they had no political power. In 494 BCE, the plebeians had had enough. They literally walked out of the city and refused to come back until they got more rights. This was called the First Secession, and it worked. The patricians needed the plebeians too much to let them leave. Over the next 200 years, the plebeians gradually won more and more rights. They got their own officials called tribunes, who could protect them from patrician abuse. They got the laws written down in something called the 12 Tables, so everyone could know what they were. Eventually, they could even hold the highest offices in the state. This struggle was crucial because it made Rome more inclusive than other ancient societies. While other empires ruled through force alone, Rome learned to integrate different groups and give them a stake in the system. With their internal politics sorted out, the Romans could finally focus on what they did best, war. But their approach to conquest was about to revolutionize the ancient world. While Romans were figuring out how to govern themselves, they were also conquering their neighbors. This took about 300 years, from roughly 500 to 200 BCE. But the way Romans conquered was different from other ancient peoples. Most conquerors would defeat an enemy, take their wealth, and leave. Romans would defeat an enemy, then offer them a deal, become our allies, provide soldiers when we need them, and in return, you can keep your own customs and local government. Some allies even got Roman citizenship. This was brilliant strategy. Instead of ruling through fear alone, Romans gave their subjects reasons to stay loyal. A defeated enemy could become a Roman ally, and a Roman ally could eventually become a Roman citizen. By 264 BCE, Rome controlled most of Italy. They had hundreds of thousands of allied soldiers they could call upon. They had learned to be flexible, persistent, and inclusive. They were ready to take on the world. So how exactly did these Italian farmers become the most feared warriors in the ancient world? The answer lies in how they thought about warfare itself. What made Roman armies so effective? It wasn't just their equipment or their numbers. It was their approach to warfare. Roman soldiers were citizens first and soldiers second. They weren't professional warriors or foreign mercenaries. They were farmers and craftsmen who served in the army because it was their duty to Rome. This meant they fought not just for pay, but for their homes and families. The Romans also revolutionized military tactics. They started by copying the Greek phalanx, a tight formation of soldiers with long spears. But they realized this was too rigid. So they developed the legion system, where soldiers were organized into smaller, more flexible units called maniples. Roman soldiers carried short swords called gladi, rectangular shields, and wore armor that allowed them to move quickly. They were trained to fight as individuals within a unit, not just as part of a mass formation, but perhaps most importantly, Romans were engineers. They built roads to move their armies quickly. They built siege engines to capture enemy cities. They built fortified camps every single night when they were on campaign. Roman generals often won battles before they were fought through superior logistics and preparation. Romans also never gave up. Other peoples might sue for peace after a major defeat. Romans would just raise another army. They had a saying, "Rome doesn't negotiate with an enemy on Roman soil." This determination made them incredibly difficult to defeat permanently. Now here's where Rome's story gets really interesting. Because by 264 BCE, these Italian farmers had conquered their entire peninsula. But across the Mediterranean, another superpower was watching, and they weren't impressed. By 264 BCE, Rome controlled Italy. But across the Mediterranean, another power was rising, Carthage. This was an ancient city in what's now Tunisia, founded by Phoenicians centuries earlier. Carthage was everything Rome wasn't, a trading empire built on commerce and wealth, not conquest and citizenship. The clash between Rome and Carthage was inevitable. It led to 3 wars called the Punic Wars, and they would determine who ruled the Mediterranean world. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, was fought mainly over Sicily. Rome had never fought a major naval war before, but they learned fast. They built a huge fleet and eventually defeated Carthage. The Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, was the big one. Carthage was led by a military genius named Hannibal. In 218 BCE, he did something that seemed impossible. He marched an army with elephants across the Alps and invaded Italy. Hannibal won battle after battle. At Cannae in 216 BCE, he surrounded and destroyed an entire Roman army. About 50,000 men died in a single day. Rome had never suffered such a catastrophic defeat. But here's where Roman character showed itself. Instead of surrendering, they refused to even negotiate. They raised new armies. They avoided fighting Hannibal directly and instead attacked Carthaginian allies. They took the war to Spain and Africa. Finally, in 202 BCE, a Roman general named Scipio defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in Africa. Carthage was finished as a major power. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE, was barely a war at all. Rome decided that Carthage was too dangerous to exist. They besieged the city for 3 years, then destroyed it completely. They killed or enslaved the population and literally salted the earth so nothing would grow there again. This might seem cruel, but it sent a clear message. Rome would go to any lengths to protect itself. The Mediterranean was now a Roman lake. With Carthage destroyed, Rome was the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. But victory has a way of creating new problems and new opportunities. After defeating Carthage, Rome turned east toward the Greek world. But this wasn't a planned conquest. It happened almost by accident. Various Greek kingdoms asked Rome for help against their enemies. Rome would send armies to help their allies, win quick victories, then go home. But gradually, they realized they needed to stay to keep the peace. Eastern conquest transformed Rome in ways no one expected. The Greeks had been civilized for centuries. They had philosophy, art, literature, and science that made Roman culture look primitive by comparison. A Roman poet named Horace later wrote, "Captive Greece captured her savage conqueror." What he meant was that even though Rome conquered Greece militarily, Greek culture conquered Rome intellectually. Wealthy Romans began studying Greek philosophy. They hired Greek tutors for their children. They collected Greek art and imitated Greek architecture. Rome was becoming sophisticated, but it was also losing some of its original character. But here's the thing about getting everything you want. Sometimes it destroys everything you are. Rome's conquests were making the state incredibly wealthy, but they were also tearing Roman society apart. Conquest made Rome incredibly wealthy, but it also created huge problems. The most serious was what happened to Roman farmers. Traditional Roman society was based on small citizen farmers who worked their own land. When war came, they would serve in the army, then return to their farms. But the Eastern wars lasted for years, not months. Farmers couldn't maintain their land while fighting in Greece or Asia. Meanwhile, the wealthy were getting richer from conquest. They bought up abandoned farms and created huge estates, worked by slaves captured in war. These estates were more efficient than small farms, which drove down food prices and made it even harder for citizen farmers to compete. The result was a massive social crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens lost their farms and moved to the city of Rome, where they became a restless, unemployed mob. The countryside was now worked by slaves instead of citizens. This changed the Roman army too. Since soldiers had to provide their own equipment, landless citizens couldn't serve. So Rome had to lower property requirements for military service. Eventually, they would recruit soldiers from the urban poor and equip them at state expense. These professional soldiers were loyal to their commanders, not to Rome itself. This would prove to be a fatal weakness in the Roman system. When a society is breaking down, someone always tries to fix it. The question is whether they'll succeed or make everything worse. By 133 BCE, Rome's problems were getting serious. The city was full of unemployed citizens. The countryside was worked by slaves. The army was becoming professional. Traditional Roman values were disappearing. Two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, tried to fix these problems. They proposed giving public land to landless citizens and subsidizing grain for the urban poor. These were reasonable reforms, but they threatened the interests of the wealthy. The Senate opposed the Gracchi brothers violently. Tiberius was murdered by a mob of senators in 133 BCE. Gaius was killed 10 years later. For the first time in Roman history, political disagreements were being settled with violence instead of debate. This was the beginning of the end for the Republic. Once Romans started killing each other over politics, there was no going back. The next crisis came with a general named Gaius Marius. He reformed the army in 107 BCE, making it fully professional in recruiting from the landless poor. Marius's soldiers were loyal to him personally, because he promised them land and loot after their service. When Marius's rival Sulla marched on Rome with his own army in 88 BCE, it was clear that the Republic was breaking down. Generals with loyal armies were more powerful than elected officials. Sulla made himself dictator and tried to restore the old system by force. He killed thousands of his enemies in something called the Prescriptions. But when he retired in 79 BCE, the same problems returned. This is where Julius Caesar comes into the story. He was born around 100 BCE into a patrician family, but he was never wealthy. What he had was incredible ambition and political genius. Caesar rose through the Roman system by making alliances with powerful men. In 60 BCE, he formed the first triumvirate with Pompey, Rome's greatest general, and Crassus, Rome's richest man. Together, they controlled the Roman state. Caesar got himself appointed governor of Gaul, modern France, in 58 BCE. At the time, Gaul was a collection of barbarian tribes that occasionally raided Roman territory. Caesar spent 8 years completely conquering it. The Gallic Wars made Caesar incredibly wealthy and gave him a devoted army. More importantly, they made him famous throughout Rome. His book about the wars, written in third person, was read by every educated Roman. But Caesar's success scared his enemies in the Senate. In 49 BCE, they ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar knew this would mean political death and probably exile or worse. Instead, he made a decision that changed history forever. He marched his army across the Rubicon River, the boundary between Gaul and Italy. "The die is cast," he reportedly said. It was the point of no return. Caesar's civil war lasted 4 years. He defeated Pompey and his supporters in battles across the Mediterranean. By 45 BCE, he was master of the Roman world. Caesar used his power to implement sweeping reforms. He gave citizenship to people throughout the empire. He reformed the calendar. He started massive building projects. He planned new colonies for landless Romans. But he also made himself dictator for life, which violated everything the Republic stood for. On March 15th, 44 BCE, a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius stabbed him to death in the Senate House. Caesar's assassins thought they were saving the Republic. Instead, they destroyed it forever. Caesar's assassins thought they were saving the Republic. Instead, they had just guaranteed its destruction. Because when you kill a popular leader, you don't restore order. You create a power vacuum. Caesar's death triggered another civil war. This time, it lasted 13 years and ended with the Republic's complete destruction. The main players were Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant, Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew and adopted son, and the senators who had killed Caesar. After defeating Caesar's assassins, Antony and Octavian turned on each other. Antony controlled the East and allied himself with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. Octavian controlled the West and portrayed himself as the defender of Roman traditions. In 31 BCE, they fought the decisive Battle of Actium in Greece. Octavian won. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where they both committed suicide. Octavian was now the sole ruler of the Roman world. But Octavian was smarter than Caesar. Instead of calling himself dictator, he claimed to be restoring the Republic. He gave back power to the Senate and the people, or so he said. In reality, Octavian kept control of the army and the provinces. He took the name Augustus, meaning revered one. He became the first Roman emperor, though he never used that title. Augustus created a system called the Principate, where he was officially just the first citizen, but actually held supreme power. This brilliant compromise lasted for centuries. What Augustus created next was something the world had never seen before and hasn't seen since. An empire so vast and so stable that people forgot what chaos looked like. Augustus's victory at Actium in 31 BCE marked the beginning of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the next 200 years, the Mediterranean world experienced unprecedented peace and prosperity. This wasn't just the absence of war. It was a complete transformation of how the ancient world worked. Before Rome, the Mediterranean was divided into hundreds of competing city-states and kingdoms, constantly fighting each other. Now it was one unified empire with one government, one currency, and one legal system. The key to Augustus's success was balance. He kept the forms of the old republic while creating an entirely new system. The Senate still met, but Augustus controlled the agenda. Citizens still voted, but only for local offices. The army was professional, but it was loyal to the emperor as the representative of Rome. Augustus also solved the problem of succession. He adopted capable men as his heirs and gradually gave them responsibility. When he died in 14 CE, his stepson Tiberius became emperor without any crisis. This system worked because it gave Romans what they wanted: peace, prosperity, and dignity. The empire was wealthy enough to provide grain subsidies and entertainment for the masses. It was stable enough for trade and commerce to flourish. It was powerful enough to defend itself against all enemies. But what was it actually like to live in this Roman world? Well, that depended entirely on who you were, and the differences were staggering. Roman society was incredibly complex and hierarchical. At the top was the emperor, worshipped as a god in the provinces. Below him were the senators, who governed provinces and commanded armies. Then came the equites, or knights, wealthy businessmen and administrators. Most Romans were ordinary citizens: farmers, craftsmen, shopkeepers, and soldiers. They had legal rights and could vote in local elections. They were protected by Roman law and could appeal to the emperor for justice. Below the citizens were the Latin allies, who had some rights but couldn't vote or hold office. Lower still were the peregrini, or foreigners, who lived in the empire but weren't citizens. At the bottom were slaves, who made up perhaps 30% of the population. But here's what made Rome different. Social mobility was possible. A slave could be freed and become a citizen. A citizen could become wealthy and join the equites. A provincial could earn citizenship through military service. The Emperor Trajan was born in Spain. The Emperor Septimius Severus was born in Africa. Women in Rome had more freedom than in most ancient societies. They could own property, run businesses, and divorce their husbands. They couldn't vote or hold office, but they could influence politics through their husbands and sons. Slavery was central to Roman society, but it was different from modern slavery. Many slaves were highly educated and worked as doctors, teachers, and administrators. Some slaves had their own slaves. Manumission, freeing slaves, was common and created a large population of freedmen loyal to Rome. Now here's where Rome gets really impressive. Because it's one thing to conquer the world. It's another thing entirely to actually run it. And Romans didn't just govern their empire. They built it. Romans were the greatest engineers in the ancient world. They built infrastructure on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. Roman roads were legendary. They built over 250,000 miles of roads connecting every corner of the empire. These weren't just dirt paths. They were engineered highways with multiple layers of stone and gravel, built to last for centuries. Many are still in use today. The saying, "all roads lead to Rome," was literally true. The road system allowed messages, goods, and armies to move quickly across vast distances. It unified the empire and made Roman control possible. Roman aqueducts were equally impressive. They built hundreds of miles of channels to bring fresh water to cities. Rome itself had 11 major aqueducts bringing water from springs up to 60 miles away. The city had better water supply than many modern cities. Roman architecture was revolutionary. They perfected the arch, the dome, and concrete. Buildings like the Pantheon in Rome, with its massive concrete dome, were engineering marvels that influenced architecture for centuries. But Roman engineering wasn't just about showing off. Everything they built had a practical purpose. Roads moved armies and trade. Aqueducts provided clean water. Amphitheaters and baths kept the population happy. Forums and basilicas facilitated commerce and government. But here's the problem with absolute power. It attracts absolutely the wrong kind of people. And sometimes it turns decent people into monsters. The 1st century CE saw some of Rome's greatest and most terrible emperors. Augustus's successors in the Julio-Claudian dynasty included both competent rulers and complete madmen. Tiberius, 14 to 37 CE, was a capable but gloomy emperor who eventually withdrew to the island of Capri and governed through letters. His heir Caligula, 37 to 41 CE, started well but became increasingly unstable. He declared himself a god, made his horse a consul, and built a bridge across the Bay of Naples just so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's armor. Caligula was assassinated by his own guards, who then found his uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain and made him emperor. Claudius, 41 to 54 CE, was physically disabled and considered an idiot by his family, but he turned out to be an excellent ruler who conquered Britain and reformed the administration. Nero, 54 to 68 CE, was the last of the Julio-Claudians. He started his reign well under the guidance of advisors, but gradually became more tyrannical. He murdered his own mother and wife, performed as an actor and chariot racer, which Romans considered beneath an emperor's dignity, and built a massive golden palace in the center of Rome. When the Great Fire of Rome burned much of the city in 64 CE, rumors spread that Nero had started it to clear land for his palace. He blamed the Christians and began the first systematic persecution of Christianity. The story that he fiddled while Rome burned is probably false, but it captures how Romans felt about him. Nero's suicide in 68 CE ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty and triggered the year of the 4 emperors. In 69 CE, 4 different men claimed to be emperor, and armies fought across the empire. This showed how dangerous it was when the succession wasn't clear. But sometimes, just sometimes, the system works. And when it does, you get something remarkable: leaders who actually deserve their power. The crisis ended when Vespasian, a general from a middle-class family, became emperor and founded the Flavian dynasty. He restored order and built the Colosseum. His son Titus completed the Colosseum and handled the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii. But the real golden age came with the 5 good emperors, 96 to 180 CE. These men, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, created a system where each emperor adopted his most capable successor instead of passing power to his son. Trajan, 98 to 117 CE, was the greatest conqueror since Caesar. He conquered Dacia, modern Romania, and Mesopotamia, expanding the empire to its greatest extent. He built markets, baths, and a massive column in Rome that still stands today. Hadrian, 117 to 138 CE, was a traveler and builder who visited every province of the empire. He built Hadrian's Wall across northern Britain to keep out the Scots. He founded cities, including Antinopolis in Egypt. He rebuilt the Pantheon and established Athens as a center of Greek culture. Antoninus Pius, 138 to 161 CE, was so peaceful that he never left Italy during his 23-year reign. The empire was so well governed that it practically ran itself. Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 CE, was a philosopher-emperor who wrote the Meditations, one of the great works of Stoic philosophy. He spent most of his reign fighting barbarians on the Danube frontier, defending an empire that was starting to face serious external pressure. So how do you actually govern an empire that stretches from Scotland to Sudan? How do you make 1 billion people with different languages, religions, and cultures feel like they're all part of the same thing? The key was flexibility and local autonomy. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by a Roman senator or knight. But within each province, local communities were allowed to govern themselves according to their own customs, as long as they paid taxes, provided soldiers, and kept the peace. Roman law was the glue that held everything together. It was based on written statutes, legal precedents, and the principle that law should be rational and fair. Romans distinguished between citizen law, which applied to Roman citizens, and the law of nations, which applied to everyone. Over time, Roman law became more universal. The jurist Gaius wrote that all people were equal before the law. This was revolutionary thinking that influenced legal systems for centuries. Romans also used citizenship as a tool of integration. At first, only people from the city of Rome were citizens, but gradually, citizenship was extended to Italian allies, then to provincials who served in the army or local government, and finally, to entire communities. In 212 CE, the Emperor Caracalla granted citizenship to all free men in the empire. This meant a farmer in Britain, a merchant in Syria, and a soldier in Spain were all equally Roman. But all good things must come to an end. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, he broke the one rule that had kept the empire stable. He left it to his son. The death of Marcus Aurelius marked the end of the Pax Romana. His son Commodus became emperor, breaking the adoptive principle that had worked so well. Commodus was more interested in fighting as a gladiator than governing the empire. The empire was also hit by a devastating plague. The Antonine Plague, possibly smallpox. It killed millions and weakened the economy. Population decline meant fewer soldiers and taxpayers at exactly the time when external pressures were increasing. The army was changing too. Marcus Aurelius had been forced to recruit barbarians to fight other barbarians. These foreign soldiers were effective, but they weren't loyal to Rome in the same way citizen soldiers had been. Commodus was assassinated in 192 CE, triggering another civil war. The winner was Septimius Severus, an African general, who founded the Severan dynasty. Severus increased army pay and gave soldiers more privileges, but this made the military even more important in politics. Severus's advice to his sons was revealing: be united, pay the soldiers, and scorn all other men. Rome was becoming a military state. What happened next was so chaotic that historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century. And when historians use the word crisis, you know things are really bad. The period from 235 to 284 CE is called the crisis of the 3rd century, and it nearly destroyed the Roman Empire. In 50 years, there were over 20 emperors, most of whom died violent deaths. These were called the barracks emperors because they were chosen by the army, not by any constitutional process. Generals would proclaim themselves emperor, march on Rome, defeat the current emperor, and then be killed by the next general a few years later. The economy collapsed. Emperors debased the currency to pay their soldiers, causing massive inflation. Trade declined because travel was dangerous. Cities shrank as people fled to the countryside for safety. The empire literally fell apart. In the West, a general named Postumus declared himself emperor of a Gallic empire that included Gaul, Britain, and Spain. In the East, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra conquered Syria, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor. Barbarian tribes invaded from the north and east. The Goths sacked Athens and Sparta. The Alemanni invaded Italy. The Persians captured the Emperor Valerian and used him as a footstool. It looked like the end of Rome, but the empire had one more comeback left. Just when it looked like Rome was finished forever, someone figured out how to put it back together. His name was Diocletian, and his solution was radical. In 284 CE, a soldier named Diocletian became emperor and implemented radical reforms that saved the empire. He realized that the empire was too large for one man to govern, so he divided it into 4 parts ruled by 4 emperors, the Tetrarchy. Diocletian ruled the east from Nicomedia, modern Istanbul. His co-emperor, Maximian, ruled the west from Milan. 2 junior emperors called Caesars ruled Gaul and the Balkans. Each emperor had his own army and administration. This system worked brilliantly. The empire was reunited, barbarian invasions were stopped, and order was restored. Diocletian also reformed the economy, the army, and the administration. But Diocletian made one crucial mistake. He launched the Great Persecution of Christians in 303 CE. Christianity had been growing steadily for 3 centuries, and by 300 CE, perhaps 10% of the empire was Christian. The persecution created martyrs and made Christianity even more popular. When Diocletian retired in 305 CE, the Tetrarchy collapsed into civil war. The winner was Constantine, who defeated his rivals at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE. According to legend, Constantine saw a vision of the Christian cross and heard the words, "In this sign, conquer." Constantine converted to Christianity and legalized it throughout the empire. In 330 CE, he founded a new capital called Constantinople, modern Istanbul, in the east. This new Rome was Christian from the beginning and would outlast the original Rome by over 1,000 years. But saving the empire was only a temporary fix, because outside Rome's borders, entire peoples were on the move, and they were heading straight for Roman territory. The 4th century saw increasing pressure from barbarian tribes along Rome's northern frontier. These weren't necessarily attacks. Many barbarians wanted to enter the empire peacefully to escape pressure from other tribes. The problem was the Huns, a nomadic people from Central Asia who were pushing westward. Under their leader Attila, they forced Germanic tribes to migrate into Roman territory. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and other tribes were refugees as much as invaders. The crisis came in 378 CE at the Battle of Adrianople. The Eastern Emperor Valens was killed, along with most of his army, fighting the Visigoths. It was Rome's worst military disaster since Cannae. The empire never fully recovered. There weren't enough Roman soldiers to control the frontiers, so emperors began hiring entire barbarian tribes as foederati, allied troops who fought for Rome in exchange for land and subsidies. This policy worked in the short term, but created long-term problems. Barbarian generals became powerful figures in the Roman government. Barbarian tribes settled in Roman territory and maintained their own customs and laws. Gradually, The Roman army became more barbarian than Roman. The empire was being transformed from within. And so we come to the end of the Western Roman Empire. But here's the thing. It didn't fall with a bang. It fell with a whimper. By 400 CE, the Western Roman Empire was barely Roman anymore. Real power lay with barbarian generals who controlled puppet emperors. The Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 CE under their king Alaric. The Vandals sacked it again in 455 CE. Each time, the barbarians didn't destroy the city. They just took its wealth and left. The last effective Western emperor was Majorian, 457 to 461 CE, who tried to restore Roman power. But he was assassinated by his own barbarian general, Ricimer, who preferred weak emperors he could control. In 476 CE, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, ironically named after Rome's founder and first emperor. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and ruled Italy as a barbarian king. This is traditionally considered the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but it wasn't a dramatic collapse. Most Romans probably didn't notice much difference. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Rome maintained many Roman institutions and customs. The senators still met in Rome. Roman law was still used. Latin was still the language of education and administration. The Catholic Church, which had become thoroughly Romanized, provided continuity. In many ways, the barbarians had become more Roman than the Romans themselves. But here's where the story gets interesting again. Because while the Western Empire was collapsing, the Eastern Empire was just getting started on its second act. While the Western Empire fell to barbarian kingdoms, the Eastern Empire survived and thrived. We call it the Byzantine Empire, but its people called themselves Romans for another 1,000 years. The Eastern Empire had several advantages. It was wealthier, with great trading cities like Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch. It was more defensible, protected by the sea and strong fortress cities. It was more Greek than Latin, which gave it a different cultural identity. The greatest Byzantine emperor was Justinian, 527 to 565 CE. He reconquered much of the old Western Empire, including Italy, North Africa, and southern Spain. He built the Hagia Sophia, one of the world's greatest architectural achievements. Most importantly, he codified Roman law in the Corpus Juris Civilis, which became the basis of legal systems throughout Europe. But Justinian's conquests were temporary. The empire was weakened by plague, wars, and the cost of his ambitious projects. After his death, most of his Western conquests were lost to new barbarian invasions. The Byzantines also faced new enemies. The Persians attacked from the east. The Slavs and Bulgars invaded from the north. Most seriously, the Arabs, unified by Islam, conquered Syria, Egypt, and North Africa in the 7th century. By 700 CE, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self. But it adapted and survived, becoming a medieval Christian empire rather than an ancient Roman one. The Byzantine Empire would survive for another 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. But it was 1,000 years of constant struggle, constant change, constant adaptation. The Byzantine Empire lasted another 750 years after the Arab conquests. It went through periods of decline and revival, but it always maintained its claim to be the continuation of Rome. The iconoclastic controversy, 726 to 843 CE, split the empire over whether religious images should be allowed. This weakened Byzantine Christianity and contributed to the final break with the Roman Catholic Church in 1054 CE. The Macedonian Renaissance, 867 to 1056 CE, saw a revival of learning and culture. Byzantine scholars preserved ancient Greek texts that would have been lost otherwise. The empire expanded into the Balkans and regained some territory in Asia Minor, but new enemies appeared. The Seljuk Turks conquered most of Asia Minor after the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 CE. The Crusades brought Western European armies through Byzantine territory, sometimes as allies, sometimes as enemies. The Fourth Crusade, 1204 CE, was a disaster for Byzantium. The Crusaders actually captured and sacked Constantinople, establishing Latin states in Greek territory. Although the Byzantines recaptured their capital in 1261 CE, the empire never fully recovered. The final blow came from the Ottoman Turks, who conquered most of the Balkans in the 14th century. By 1450 CE, the Byzantine Empire consisted of little more than Constantinople and a few islands. On May 29, 1453 CE, Ottoman forces breached the walls of Constantinople. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting on the walls. The Roman Empire, which had lasted for 2,206 years, finally came to an end. So that's how the Roman Empire finally ended, not with the dramatic collapse of the Western Empire, but with the quiet fall of Constantinople in 1453. But here's the amazing thing. Rome never really died. The Roman Empire ended in 1453 CE, but its influence never died. Rome shaped the modern world in ways that are still visible today. Our legal systems are based on Roman law. The United States Constitution borrowed ideas from the Roman Republic. Our languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, evolved from Latin. English is full of Latin words and phrases. Roman architecture influences buildings everywhere. The dome of the U.S. Capitol is modeled on Roman temples. Government buildings around the world use Roman columns and arches. Even modern concrete is based on Roman formulas. Christianity, which now has over 2 billion followers, was shaped by Roman culture. The Catholic Church's organization mirrors the Roman Imperial administration. The Pope's title comes from the Roman Pontifex Maximus. Roman engineering principles are still used today. The interstate highway system follows Roman models. Modern aqueducts use Roman techniques. Roman military tactics influenced warfare for centuries. The idea of citizenship itself comes from Rome. Before Rome, people belonged to tribes or served kings. Romans created the concept that people could be citizens of a state with rights and responsibilities. This idea spread throughout the world and became the foundation of modern democracy. Even the European Union can be seen as an attempt to recreate Roman unity. Like Rome, it seeks to unite diverse peoples under common laws and institutions. Like Rome, it struggles with questions of identity, immigration, and governance. So, what can we learn from this incredible 2,200-year journey? What lessons can a modern world take from the rise and fall of Rome? What can we learn from Rome's 2,200-year journey? First, that adaptability is crucial for survival. Rome succeeded because it could change with the times. When the city-state model stopped working, Romans created a republic. When the republic failed, they created an empire. When the empire split, the eastern half survived by becoming something new. Second, that inclusion creates strength. Rome's greatest achievement was turning enemies into allies and allies into citizens. The empire lasted as long as it did because millions of people had a stake in its success. When that inclusiveness broke down, the empire fell apart. Third, that no empire lasts forever. Rome seemed eternal to its inhabitants, but it was always changing. The Rome of Augustus was different from the Rome of Caesar, which was different from the Rome of the kings. Change is the only constant in history. Fourth, that leadership matters. Rome's greatest periods came under capable leaders like Augustus, Trajan, and Constantine. Its worst periods came under weak or incompetent rulers. Individual decisions can change the course of history. Finally, that cultural influence can outlast political power. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, but Roman culture shaped the medieval world. Roman law, Roman architecture, Roman language, and Roman ideas continued to influence civilization long after the last emperor was gone. And that brings us back to where we started. Not with ruins and relics, but with a living legacy that surrounds us every day. Today, you can still visit Rome and see the layers of history. The Colosseum, where gladiators fought. The Pantheon, with its incredible dome. The Forum, where senators debated the fate of the world. The roads that connected an empire. But Rome's real legacy isn't in its ruins. It's in the world we live in today. Every time you use a word derived from Latin, every time you see a government building with columns, every time you think about your rights as a citizen, you're experiencing the echo of Rome. The Roman Empire lasted for over 2,000 years. It grew from a small Italian city-state to the master of the known world. It created institutions, laws, and ideas that still shape our lives. It proved that different peoples can live together under common laws, and that citizenship is more powerful than ethnicity. Rome fell, but in a very real sense, it never died. As the poet Ovid wrote, Rome has grown so great that she has made herself the world. That world is still with us today. The story of Rome is the story of human ambition, achievement, and failure. It's the story of how a group of people created something greater than themselves and watched it transform the world. It's a story that continues to inspire and warn us about the possibilities and dangers of power. In the end, Rome's greatest achievement wasn't its conquests or its buildings. It was the idea that all people, regardless of where they were born or what gods they worshipped, could become Romans. That idea of inclusive citizenship became the foundation of the modern world. Rome may have fallen, but its spirit lives on in every democracy, every constitution, and every person who believes in the power of law and the dignity of citizenship. The Roman Empire is gone, but Rome itself, the idea of Rome, is eternal. From the 7 hills of a small Italian city to the master of 3 continents, from republic to empire to memory, Rome's journey spans over 2 millennia. It's a story of triumph and tragedy, of glory and decline, of human ambition and human folly. But most of all, it's a story that's still being written. Every time we vote, every time we demand our rights, every time we build something meant to last, we're continuing the Roman story. The empire may be gone, but the idea of Rome, that diverse peoples can unite under common laws and shared values, remains as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. Rome didn't just conquer the ancient world, it created the template for our modern one. And in that sense, we are all Romans now. That's the story of Rome, not just the greatest empire in history, but the foundation of the world we live in today. From a city-state to a global civilization, from legend to reality to eternal influence, Rome's journey is humanity's journey. And like Rome itself, that journey continues.